Imagine standing on the deck of a warship in the early morning darkness of April 1st, 1945, watching the largest amphibious armada ever assembled in the Pacific War approach a small island 340 miles from mainland Japan. More than 1,600 ships carrying 350,000 naval personnel and 183,000 ground troops converge on Okinawa. The air thrums with the sound of aircraft engines. The water churns white with the wakes of countless vessels, and ahead lies an island that will become the bloodiest battlefield of the Pacific Theater. Private Eugene Sledge, a young Marine from Alabama, clutches his rifle as his landing craft approaches the beaches. He expects hell. They all do. The memories of Peleliu, where he watched friends die in coral caves and hellish heat, still haunt his dreams, but something feels wrong. The beaches ahead are quiet. Too quiet. On that Easter Sunday morning, American forces land, expecting to face the full fury of Japanese resistance immediately. Instead, they encounter almost no opposition. Soldiers and Marines pour ashore, advancing quickly inland, some joking nervously about the easy landing. They don't know yet that this eerie calm is deliberate, that 110,000 Japanese troops are waiting for them in the south, dug into an underground fortress unlike anything they've encountered before. For 82 days, Okinawa would become what the Japanese called Tetsu no Ami, the Reign of Steel. The Americans would call it the toughest battle they ever fought. This small island, just 60 miles long and varying from 2 to 18 miles wide, would consume lives on a scale that defied comprehension. Before it ended, more than 12,000 Americans would die, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers would be killed, and between 100,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians, nearly a third of the island's pre-war population, would perish. The blood spilled on Okinawa would ultimately help end World War II, but the cost would haunt everyone who survived. This is the story of courage and fear, of strategy and sacrifice, of an island that became a graveyard and a turning point in history. This is the story of the last great battle of the Pacific War. By early 1945, the outcome of World War II in the Pacific was no longer in doubt. The question was not if Japan would be defeated, but how, and at what cost. Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping campaign had driven Japanese forces back across the Pacific Island by Bloody Island. Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima. Each name represented thousands of casualties and lessons learned in the brutal arithmetic of amphibious warfare. Okinawa represented the final stepping stone to Japan itself. Located in the Ryukyu Islands chain, approximately 340 miles south of the Japanese home island of Kyushu, Okinawa possessed what American planners desperately needed: airfields and harbors from which to launch Operation Downfall. The planned invasion of mainland Japan, scheduled for autumn 1945. If captured and developed, Okinawa would become an unsinkable aircraft carrier, capable of staging thousands of aircraft for the final assault on Japan. The Americans understood the island's value. So did the Japanese. For Japan, Okinawa represented the last barrier protecting the home islands. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo knew that if Okinawa fell, the American juggernaut would be positioned directly at Japan's doorstep. The island had to be held, or at least defended long enough to bleed the Americans so badly that they would negotiate a peace that preserved something of the empire. The strategic calculations were grimly simple on both sides. American planners needed Okinawa to avoid the horrific casualties that a direct assault on Japan's beaches would entail. Japanese planners intended to make taking Okinawa so costly that the Americans would recoil from the even bloodier prospect of invading Kyushu and Honshu. The Japanese defense, the 32nd Army. The defense of Okinawa fell to Lieutenant General Matsuru Oshijima, a 57-year-old career officer who had fought in China and earned a reputation as a skilled tactician who led from the front lines. In August 1944, Oshijima took command of the newly formed 32nd Army, charged with transforming Okinawa into a fortress. Ushijima's force initially numbered close to 110,000 men, including 77,000 Imperial Japanese Army troops, about 10,000 Imperial Japanese Navy personnel, and some 24,000 Okinawan conscripts, many of them elderly men, teenagers, and even schoolchildren pressed into military service. The force included the veteran 24th Division, the 62nd Division, composed of troops experienced in China, and the reconstituted 44th Independent Mixed Brigade. However, Japanese High Command dealt Ushijima a devastating blow in December 1944 when they withdrew his best unit, the experienced 9th Division, to defend Formosa, believing the Americans would strike there first. This left Ushijima with a significantly weakened force just months before the expected invasion. Replacement troops never arrived due to American submarine and air dominance. Working with his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, and his brilliant operations officer, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, Ushijima devised a defensive strategy unlike any the Americans had yet encountered in the Pacific. Rather than attempting to stop the invasion at the beaches, a strategy that had failed repeatedly on other islands, Ushijima would allow the Americans to land unopposed, then draw them into a carefully prepared killing zone in southern Okinawa. The defensive plan centered on the Shuri Line, a series of ridges, hills, and ancient tombs in southern Okinawa, anchored by the historic Shuri Castle. For months, Japanese troops and Okinawan laborers carved an elaborate network of caves, tunnels, and fortified positions into the limestone hills. These weren't simple foxholes or shallow caves, but complex underground facilities complete with command posts, hospitals, supply depots, and firing positions. Many caves had multiple entrances and exits, allowing defenders to retreat through tunnels when one position became untenable, only to reappear elsewhere. The defensive system was brilliant in its simplicity and deadly in its execution. Artillery and mortar were positioned on reverse slopes, invisible to American observation, but capable of delivering devastating fire on approaching troops. Machine gun positions were mutually supporting, meaning an attack on one would bring fire from multiple others. The ancient Okinawan tombs, made of reinforced concrete, provided ready-made pillars. Ushijima's strategy, largely crafted by Colonel Yahara, was called Jikusen, a defensive war of attrition, designed to inflict maximum casualties while preserving Japanese forces for as long as possible. Every ridge would cost the Americans hundreds or thousands of casualties. Every cave would require flamethrowers and explosives to clear. The battle would not be won quickly or isolated. The American force assembled for Operation Iceberg, as the Okinawa invasion was codenamed, dwarfed anything previously seen in the Pacific. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., son of a Confederate Civil War general, commanded the 10th Army, a unique joint force combining U.S. Army and Marine divisions, along with their own tactical air force. Buckner's ground forces included 4 Army divisions, the 7th, 27th, 77th, and 96th Infantry Divisions, and 3 Marine divisions, the 1st, 2nd, and 6th Marine Divisions. The Marines, including Sledge's 1st Marine Division, had earned fearsome reputations at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliui, and Iwo Jima. The Army divisions had fought across the Pacific and in some cases in Europe as well. Supporting this ground force was Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet, including Admiral Mark Mitchell's Task Force 58, the most powerful carrier task force ever assembled. The naval armada included battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of support vessels. It represented the full might of American industrial power projected across 6,000 miles of ocean. American intelligence estimated Japanese strength at around 65,000 troops, a significant underestimate that would have deadly consequences. Planners expected the battle to last weeks, perhaps into early summer. No one imagined it would drag on for nearly 3 months, or that casualties would approach those of some of the largest battles fought in Europe. The Okinawan people, caught between armies. Often overlooked in accounts of the battle are the Okinawans themselves, approximately 300,000 civilians who found themselves trapped between 2 massive armies fighting for control of their homeland. The Okinawans had a complex relationship with mainland Japan. The Ryukyu Kingdom had been an independent tributary state of China until Japan forcibly annexed it in 1879, renaming it Okinawa Prefecture. Many Okinawans still maintained distinct cultural and linguistic traditions from mainland Japanese. When war came to Okinawa, the civilian population faced impossible choices. Japanese military authorities had initiated evacuations beginning in 1944, and Ushijima managed to evacuate approximately 80,000 people from Okinawa and 30,000 from the Yoyama Islands before the invasion. However, the sinking of the evacuation ship Tsushima Maru by an American submarine in August 1944, killing more than 1,600 civilians, including many children, created panic and made many Okinawans reluctant to leave. Those who remained found themselves increasingly militarized. Japanese forces conscripted thousands of Okinawan men as laborers to dig fortifications. Even more tragically, they conscripted students, boys as young as 14 years old, into units like the Blood and Iron Imperial Corps, Tikitsu Kinatai, and girls aged 15 to 19, into nursing units like the Himeyari Corps. Over 1,500 boys were drafted into the Blood and Iron Imperial Corps. More than half would die in the battle. Of 222 girls and 18 teachers mobilized for the Himeyari Corps, 136 would be killed. Japanese authorities also fed Okinawan civilians a steady diet of propaganda, portraying American soldiers as barbarous monsters who would rape and murder civilians. This propaganda, combined with the Japanese military's distribution of grenades and poison to civilian families, would lead to one of the battle's most tragic aspects: mass suicides of Okinawan civilians who chose death over capture by Americans. April 1, 1945. The invasion force approached Okinawa's western coast in the pre-dawn darkness of Easter Sunday. Naval gunfire had already been pounding the island for days, and carrier aircraft had been striking targets since late March. As the landing craft approached the Hagushi beaches on Okinawa's western coast, tension among the assault troops was palpable. Veterans remembered the murderous fire that met them at Terawa Saipan and Iwo Jima. Many expected to die on the beach. Then, something strange happened. Nothing. The landing craft grounded, ramps dropped, and troops rushed ashore into silence. There was no wall of machine gun fire, no artillery bombardment, no suicide attacks, just empty beaches and abandoned defenses. More than 60,000 troops landed on that first day with casualties so light that some units reported 0 losses. Sledge later wrote of the surreal experience. It was an anticlimactic and somewhat embarrassing situation. We had steeled ourselves for a bloodbath, and here we were moving inland without opposition. Soldiers and Marines advanced quickly, securing the central portion of the island, bisecting it from east to west within hours. Marine units wheeled north, Army units headed south, both expected to encounter serious resistance at any moment. In the north, Marines found light opposition from small Japanese units and local defense forces. After some sharp fighting in the Motobu Peninsula and a brutal week-long battle for Ie Shima, where beloved war correspondent Ernie Pyle was killed by a sniper, on April 18, the northern two-thirds of Okinawa was secured by late April. The island's valuable airfields at Yonton and Kadena were captured intact and quickly put into operation. But in the south, everything changed. First contact, the Kakazu Ridge nightmare. On April 8, elements of the U.S. Army's 96th Infantry Division reached Kakazu Ridge, the first major defensive line of Oshijima's elaborate fortress system. What happened next shattered any illusions about an easy campaign. The 96th attacked on April 9, and 2 companies managed to reach the ridge's summit, only to be met by devastating fire from mutually supporting positions on Kakazu West and surrounding hills. Lieutenant Willard Mitchell led his company to the top of Kakazu Ridge that morning. His men couldn't dig into the hard coral rock, leaving them exposed to rifle fire and grenades from all directions. The Japanese, hidden in caves and bunkers throughout the ridge, launched vicious counterattacks with grenades and satchel charges. Mitchell's men held through desperate hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and rifle butts. But casualties mounted horrifically. By day's end, American casualties had nearly doubled from all previous fighting on Okinawa. The rapid advance was over. Kakazu Ridge held for nearly 2 weeks, bleeding 3 American divisions before finally falling on April 21. Thousands died on both sides in a preview of what was to come. The fight for Kakazu revealed the nature of Ushijima's defensive system. Every ridge concealed elaborate fortifications. Every hill had to be taken multiple times as Japanese troops reoccupied positions through underground tunnels. Artillery positioned on reverse slopes remained invisible until they fired. American superiority in tanks and air support meant little when the enemy was underground. Hell at sea. The kamikaze strike. While soldiers and marines struggled ashore, the Fifth Fleet faced its own nightmare. On April 6, the Japanese launched Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, the first of 10 massive kamikaze attacks that would target the American fleet throughout the battle. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft, many piloted by young men barely trained to fly, dove deliberately into American ships. The attacks were devastating. On May 11, the aircraft carrier USS Bunker Hill, flagship of Task Force 58, was struck by 2 kamikazes within 30 seconds. The first Zero fighter dropped a 550-pound bomb that penetrated the flight deck before exploding outside the ship. The pilot then crashed into aircraft parked on the flight deck, igniting massive fires. 30 seconds later, a second Zero struck near the ship's island superstructure. The carnage was indescribable. Gasoline fires erupted across the flight deck. Ammunition exploded. Of the carrier's 1,200-man complement, 396 sailors and airmen died, including 43 missing, whose remains were never found. Another 264 were wounded. Admiral Mitcher, whose flagship cabin was destroyed, transferred to the carrier Enterprise. The Bunker Hill survived, but took no further part in the war. The kamikaze attacks continued relentlessly. Between April and June 1945, approximately 1,900 kamikaze aircraft attacked the Fifth Fleet, sinking 36 ships and damaging 368 others. More American sailors died off Okinawa than in any other naval battle of World War II. The psychological impact was profound. There was no defense against a pilot determined to die. Sailors manned anti-aircraft guns for weeks on end, watching the sky for the next suicide attack that could come at any moment. The Shuri Line. Hills of Death. By late April, American forces confronted the full strength of the Shuri Line. This defensive system, centered on the ancient Shuri Castle that dominated the surrounding terrain, consisted of a series of ridges and hills with sinister names: Kakazu, Nishibaru, Tanabaru, Dakeshi, Wana, Conical Hill, Sugarloaf, Horseshoe, Half Moon. Each would become synonymous with slaughter. The battle developed into what veterans called one damned ridge after another. Artillery barrages that would have destroyed surface fortifications barely scratched the underground positions. Tanks bogged down in the rough terrain or were destroyed by well-positioned anti-tank guns. Infantry had to take each position with rifles, grenades, flamethrowers, and pure courage. Private First Class Desmond Doss, a combat medic with the 77th Infantry Division and a conscientious objector who refused to carry a weapon, personified the heroism and horror of these battles. In late April and early May, Doss's battalion repeatedly attacked the Maida Escarpment, a 400-foot cliff the soldiers called Hacksaw Ridge. The fighting at Hacksaw Ridge was hellish. After the battalions secured the ridgetop on May 5, Doss's Sabbath, a massive Japanese counterattack drove the Americans back down the escarpment. All retreated, except Doss. Alone on the ridge with dozens of wounded men, Doss spent hours treating injuries under fire, then dragging soldiers one by one to the cliff's edge, where he lowered them down by rope sling. After each rescue, he reportedly prayed, "Dear God, let me get just one more man." Over several hours, Doss saved 75 men. Later, he would be wounded himself by a grenade that tore into his leg and hip. His actions earned him the Medal of Honor, one of 24 awarded for actions on Okinawa. the 6th Marine Division faced an equally desperate struggle at Sugarloaf Hill, a deceptively small rise that was actually the western anchor of the Shuri Line. Sugarloaf was part of a defensive complex, including Horseshoe Hill and Half Moon Hill, all connected by underground tunnels and mutually supporting firing positions. The Marines first attacked Sugarloaf on May 12, expecting to take it quickly. Instead, they ran into a meat grinder. Every time Marines reached the summit, devastating fire from Horseshoe and Half Moon drove them back. Japanese troops poured through tunnels to reoccupy Sugarloaf before the Marines could consolidate. For a week, the 22nd and 29th Marine Regiments were shot to pieces attacking Sugarloaf. On May 14, Major Henry Courtney Jr. led a charge that reached the crest, but he was cut down by a mortar shell, earning a posthumous Medal of Honor. The 4th Marines, committed as the Division Reserve, finally secured Sugarloaf on May 19 after 7 days of continuous combat. The cost was staggering. Over 3,000 casualties for one small hill. An untold number of Japanese died in the defensive complex. One veteran later said, by some estimates, as many as 2,500 Japanese soldiers died defending Sugarloaf. The ferocity of the Japanese defense surprised everyone. The schoolchildren's tragedy. Among the most heartbreaking aspects of the battle was the fate of Okinawa's conscripted students. The 222 girls and 18 teachers of the Haimayuri Corps, mobilized from 2 girls' schools in Naha, had been told they would work in a clean hospital with Red Cross protection. Instead, they found themselves in a series of approximately 30 muddy, dark caves that served as field hospitals. The cave hospitals had no Red Cross markings, no clean wards, no protection from bombardment. Wounded soldiers lay on narrow wooden planks in near-total darkness. The air was thick with the stench of infected wounds, gangrene, and death. Flies and maggots were everywhere. The teenage girls, many only 15 or 16 years old, had to treat hideous wounds, help perform amputations without anesthesia, empty bedpans, and prepare bodies for burial. As American forces closed in on the hospital caves in mid-June, the Japanese military dissolved the Haimayuri unit and simply told the girls to go home in the middle of a raging battle. Up to that point, 19 students had been killed. In the week following the dissolution order, approximately 80% of the remaining girls and teachers died. On June 19, the most horrific incident occurred when American forces attacked the Aihara 3rd Surgery Cave. White phosphorus munitions killed 5 teachers and 46 students who were hiding inside. One survivor, Miyagi Kikuko, described hiding in the pitch-dark cave as it filled with choking white smoke while her friends called out for their mothers before dying. Overall, 136 of the mobilized Haimayuri Corps members died, 123 students and 13 teachers. The total death toll for both schools, including those not mobilized, reached 227 out of a student population of around 300. Many died not in combat but by suicide, having been taught to fear capture more than death. Some threw themselves off the cliffs at Arasaki. Others used poison or grenades given to them by Japanese soldiers. The boys of the Blood and Iron Imperial Corps fared no better. Of 1,500 drafted students, over 800 died. Initially assigned to labor duties, by late in the battle many were given explosives and sent on suicide missions against American tanks. Across all 21 Okinawan high schools and junior high schools whose students were conscripted, 2,049 died. Their mobilization had no legal basis in Japanese law. They were children forced into military service to feed the machinery of war. The torrential rains, May's agony. In mid-May, as American forces finally began to crack the outer defenses of the Shuri Line, the weather turned. The plum rains that Okinawa experienced each spring arrived, and they continued, day after day for weeks. The battlefield became a hellscape of mud, water, and decomposing corpses. It rained here all night last night, and has rained all day today, wrote Private Al Henderson of the 96th Recon Troop to his wife. Shore is sloppy. You can't hardly walk. The ground is so muddy and slick. The rain was relentless. turning Okinawa's red clay soil into a viscous soup that swallowed men to their knees. Foxholes filled with water. Tanks and trucks bogged down and couldn't move. The rain brought operations nearly to a standstill. Heavy equipment couldn't be moved. Artillery had to be manhandled into position. Tanks that could navigate the terrain became precious assets. Supplies had to be carried forward by hand through knee-deep mud. Evacuation of wounded became agonizingly slow, as stretcher-bearers slipped and slid down muddy slopes. Worst of all, the dead couldn't be buried properly. Bodies lay in the mud, rapidly decomposing in the warm, wet conditions. The stench became overpowering. Disease spread. Dysentery, foot infections, and other maladies sapped men's strength as surely as combat. Veterans would later say the psychological impact of fighting in the rain and mud, surrounded by corpses, was as devastating as the combat itself. Yet the fighting continued. The 1st Marine Division battled for Wana Ridge and Wana Draw, a broad, shallow basin completely exposed to Japanese fire from 3 sides. For 9 days, starting May 13th, the division was repeatedly thrown back despite coordinated attacks by infantry, tanks, and artillery. When the rains began on May 22nd, prospects for success dimmed even further as tanks and heavy weapons bogged down. Ushijima's fatal decision. By early May 1945, Lieutenant General Ushijima faced a critical decision. For more than a month, Colonel Yahara's strategy of defensive attrition had worked exactly as planned. The Americans had suffered massive casualties, while Japanese forces remained largely intact underground. The defensive system could continue bleeding the enemy for months. But Lieutenant General Isumo Cho, Ushijima's impetuous chief of staff, had other ideas. Cho was a warrior in the traditional samurai mold, aggressive, offensive-minded, contemptuous of defensive tactics. Maintaining a sustained defense was anathema to him. Throughout April, Cho argued stridently for a massive counterattack to throw the Americans back. Yahara vehemently opposed this plan. The Americans had overwhelming superiority in firepower. Japanese troops leaving their fortified positions would be slaughtered. A counterattack would accomplish nothing, except wasting precious troops and ammunition needed for the defensive battle. The debate raged in the 32nd Army headquarters beneath Shuri Castle. In the end, Ushijima sided with his chief of staff. On May 3rd, he ordered the largest Japanese counterattack of the battle, coordinated with massive artillery bombardment and kamikaze strikes. The attack was a catastrophic failure. Japanese troops emerged from their caves and fortifications, only to be cut down by American artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire. The coordinated kamikaze strikes achieved nothing. By dawn on May 5th, more than 6,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Numerous artillery pieces had been destroyed when they were brought out into the open to support the attack. Irreplaceable ammunition was expended. The failed counterattack would prove to be the beginning of the end for the 32nd. Army Ushijima had weakened his defenses for nothing. Within days, the weakened flanks of the Shuri line began to crumble under renewed American assault. Historians would later question why Ushijima approved the attack. Some suggest he felt obligated to demonstrate fighting spirit to imperial headquarters in Tokyo. Others believe he was worn down by Cho's constant arguments. Whatever the reason, the decision doomed the Shuri line and tens of thousands of men on both sides. Breaking through, the Shuri line collapses. Following the failed Japanese counterattack, American commanders sensed weakness in the enemy defenses. In mid-May, despite the torrential rains that had turned the battlefield into a quagmire, Buckner ordered renewed offensives against both flanks of the Shuri line. To the west, the Marines of the 6th Division, having finally secured Sugarloaf Hill, pushed toward Naha and the Oroku Peninsula. The 1st Marine Division continued its grinding battle for Wana Ridge. In the east, Army divisions attacked Conical Hill and other The Japanese defenders fought with desperate ferocity, but their ammunition and supplies were running low. The failed counterattack had cost them troops and weapons they couldn't replace. American artillery and naval gunfire pounded Japanese positions relentlessly. It was estimated that approximately 200,000 artillery shells struck the Shuri area, along with 450 tons of bombs dropped in numerous air attacks. By late May, the situation became critical for Ushijima. His defensive line was collapsing. On May 22, he made another fateful decision: to abandon Shuri and retreat to the southernmost part of Okinawa for a final stand. The withdrawal began on May 22 under cover of the torrential rains and continued over several nights. On May 29, Marines of the 1st Division's 5th Regiment raised the flag over Shuri Castle, the ancient seat of the Ryukyu Kingdom and the cornerstone of Japanese defenses. Captain Julian Dusenberry of Company A, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, led the final assault on the castle, which fell with surprisingly light resistance since most Japanese troops had already withdrawn. The fall of Shuri Castle was a milestone in the campaign, both strategically and psychologically. The medieval fortress that had stood for centuries, that had served as Ushijima's headquarters, was now in American hands. For the Americans, it represented a decisive victory. For the Japanese, it symbolized that the end was near. But the battle was far from over. Ushijima, accompanied by General Cho and Colonel Yahara, had retreated to a bunker near Hill 89 on Okinawa's southern coast. Approximately 30,000 Japanese troops retreated with them to establish a final defensive line in the rugged terrain of southern Okinawa. The most terrible phase of the battle was about to begin. The final agony, southern Okinawa. The last defensive line in southern Okinawa lacked the carefully prepared underground positions of the Shuri line. Instead, it consisted of isolated defensive positions scattered across rugged terrain. Japanese troops occupied whatever caves and positions they could find. Communication between units began to break down as American forces fragmented the defensive line into smaller pockets. By this stage, the character of the battle had changed. Organized Japanese resistance was crumbling. Increasing numbers of Japanese soldiers and Okinawan conscripts surrendered, something almost unheard of earlier in the Pacific War. The Japanese military's iron discipline was failing under the relentless American pressure and the obvious hopelessness of the situation. But the killing continued. American forces had to root out defenders from every cave and crevice. Flamethrowers became the primary weapon, shooting jets of burning napalm into cave entrances. Explosives sealed caves where defenders refused to surrender. The southern battleground became an incinerated wasteland of blackened earth, shattered coral, and death. The civilian toll in southern Okinawa was particularly horrific. Tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians had fled south ahead of the American advance, or been driven there by Japanese troops. Now they were trapped in the battle zone with nowhere to go. Many hid in caves that became targets of American flamethrowers and explosives. Others were killed by artillery and airstrikes that made no distinction between combatants and non-combatants. The Japanese military's treatment of Okinawan civilians grew increasingly brutal. General Cho was ruthless in his treatment of the Okinawans, announcing that the army would seize all food supplies. The army's mission was to win, and it would not allow itself to be defeated by helping starving civilians, Cho reportedly said. Okinawans who fled toward American lines were sometimes shot by Japanese soldiers as spies or deserters. The mass suicides that had begun earlier in the battle reached their tragic peak in the south. Whole families died together, detonating grenades or taking poison rather than face capture. Japanese propaganda about American atrocities proved so effective that many Okinawans genuinely believed death was preferable to surrender. Some threw themselves from the high cliffs at Arasaki rather than be captured. The death of commanders. On June 18, 1945, tragedy struck the American command. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., the 10th Army commander, was visiting a forward observation post near the southern tip of Okinawa. Despite warnings from his aides about the danger, the 58-year-old general insisted on seeing the front lines for himself, a habit that had characterized his entire career. At approximately 1 p.m., a Japanese artillery position, likely a Type 96 15 cm howitzer, spotted Buckner and his party and opened fire. An exploding shell sent shrapnel tearing into Buckner's chest. He was carried to an aid station, but died on the operating table. The highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in World War II. Buckner's death stunned the 10th Army and the nation. Command passed to Marine General Roy Geiger, the 3rd Amphibious Corps commander, making him the only Marine officer ever to command a field army. Geiger, a close friend of Buckner's and a highly respected leader, immediately took charge. Within days, organized Japanese resistance collapsed, though fighting would continue until officially declared ended on June 22. For days after Buckner's death, on June 22, Lieutenant General Ushijima and Lieutenant General Cho committed ritual suicide at their command post on Hill 89. Colonel Yahara To, who had advocated the defensive strategy that had cost so many American lives, was captured and chose to live. In his final message before his death, Cho wrote, "I depart without regret, shame, or obligations. It was a warrior's exit, but one that left Okinawa in ruins and more than 200,000 people dead." Declaring victory. On June 21, 1945, American forces declared Okinawa secure. General Geiger, knowing he would soon be replaced by General Joseph Stilwell, raised the flag and claimed victory for his fallen friend Buckner, and for the Marines and soldiers who had fought for 82 days. But the declaration of victory was somewhat premature. Fighting continued for several more days as American forces mopped up the last pockets of resistance. Additional thousands of Japanese soldiers were killed or captured in the final days of June and early July. The official end date of the campaign is listed as July 2, 1945. The human cost. The final casualty figures for the Battle of Okinawa are staggering by any measure. American ground forces suffered approximately 49,151 casualties, including 12,520 killed or missing. The Marines and soldiers who fought there called it the worst battle they had ever seen. Worse than Iwo Jima. Worse than Peleliu. Worse than anything in the Pacific War. The naval casualties added another dimension to the horror. More than 4,900 sailors died in the kamikaze attacks off Okinawa, with another 4,800 wounded. Total American casualties, including naval personnel, reached approximately 50,000. One-third of all American casualties in the entire Pacific War occurred at Okinawa. Japanese casualties were catastrophic. Approximately 110,000 Japanese military personnel died in the battle, including the 32nd Army, Naval Forces, and Okinawan conscripts wearing Japanese uniforms. Of the 110,000 Japanese troops on the island when the battle began, only about 7,000 survived as prisoners. But the highest toll fell on Okinawan civilians. Between 100,000 and 150,000 Okinawans died in the battle, approximately one-third to one-half. Of the pre-war population of 300,000, they died from artillery fire, naval gunfire, airstrikes, starvation, disease, suicide, and murder by both Japanese and American forces. Whole families were wiped out. Entire villages ceased to exist. The Okinawan people suffered what many survivors would call the sacrifice of the lamb. Unlike mainland Japanese, Okinawans had little voice in the military decisions that brought war to their island. Yet they paid the highest price. The Battle of Okinawa took the lives of more than 200,000 lives, half of them local civilians. The decision to use the atomic bomb, the carnage at Okinawa, had profound implications for how World War II would end. As President Harry Truman and his advisors contemplated Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, the casualty projections were beyond anything yet seen. If Okinawa, a relatively small island, had cost 50,000 American casualties, what would invading Kyushu and Honshu cost? The Japanese had demonstrated at Okinawa that they would fight to the last man, that they would use civilians as human shields and press them into military service, that they would employ suicide tactics on a massive scale. Military planners estimated that invading Japan proper could result in 500,000 to 1 million American casualties. The Battle of Okinawa thus became a factor in the decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Historians debate the extent to which Okinawa influenced this decision, but there is no doubt that the battle demonstrated the horrific cost of a conventional invasion of Japan. When the atomic bombs fell on August 6 and August 9, killing between 150,000 and 200,000 Japanese civilians, President Truman justified the decision partly on the grounds of avoiding another Okinawa on a much larger scale. The occupation and aftermath. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. For Okinawa, however, suffering continued. The island lay in ruins. Infrastructure was destroyed. Farmland was contaminated or covered with debris. Thousands of unexploded munitions littered the landscape and still do today. The social fabric of Okinawan society had been torn apart. The United States military occupied Okinawa and would continue to administer it until 1972, 27 years after the battle ended. During this time, the U.S. military constructed massive bases on the island, displacing Okinawans from their ancestral lands. The bases remain controversial to this day, with many Okinawans feeling they continue to bear a disproportionate burden for Japan's defense and the U.S.-Japan alliance. The Battle of Okinawa left deep psychological scars on survivors. For decades, many Okinawans couldn't speak about their experiences. The trauma was too great. Survivor's guilt, PTSD, though it wasn't called that at the time, depression, and other mental health issues plagued thousands of people. The controversy over the group suicides, Shudanjiketsu, continues to this day. In 2007, the Japanese Education Ministry attempted to remove references to Japanese military coercion in these mass suicides from history textbooks, sparking massive protests in Okinawa. Okinawans viewed this as an attempt to whitewash history and deny their suffering. The controversy reflects ongoing tensions between Okinawa and mainland Japan over the battle's memory and meaning. Military lessons. From a military perspective, the Battle of Okinawa provided crucial lessons about amphibious warfare, joint operations, and the challenge of attacking heavily fortified positions. The Japanese defensive strategy at Okinawa, allowing the enemy to land, then bleeding them through defense in depth from underground fortifications, proved far more effective than attempting to stop invasions at the beach. American forces learned that overwhelming firepower alone couldn't overcome determined defenders in well-prepared positions. Every cave had to be cleared by infantry, often using flamethrowers and explosives at close range. Tanks and artillery could support, but not replace infantry in this type of terrain and defensive system. The Joint Army-Marine Command under Buckner, though not without friction, demonstrated that inter-service cooperation could work at the Army level. The integration of naval forces, carrier aviation, and ground forces created a combined arms team that, despite the casualties, ultimately succeeded in its mission. The kamikaze attacks revealed vulnerabilities in naval task forces and led to improvements in combat air patrol tactics, anti-aircraft defenses, and ship damage control. The psychological impact of suicide attacks also became a subject of study for military science. Remembrance and reconciliation. Today, Okinawa is dotted with memorials, museums, and monuments remembering the battle. The Okinawa Prefectural Peace Memorial Museum, located at the southern tip of the island where the final battle occurred, presents the history from Okinawan, Japanese, and American perspectives. The Cornerstone of Peace memorial lists the names of all who died in the battle: Japanese, American Allied forces, and Okinawan civilians without distinction of nationality. The Haimayuri Peace Museum stands beside the cave where the largest single loss of student nurses occurred, telling their tragic story. Veterans from both sides have visited these sites, some meeting former enemies, attempting to make peace with their memories and each other. The battle's legacy extends beyond military history. For Okinawans, it represents a defining trauma, a moment when their island became expendable in others' wars. The memory of the battle continues to shape Okinawan identity and fuels opposition to the continued military presence on the island. The Battle of Okinawa stands as one of the most brutal and tragic battles in human history. For 82 days, three groups of people, Americans, Japanese, and Okinawans, were caught in a maelstrom of violence that defied comprehension. More than 250,000 people died on an island just 60 miles long. What can we learn from this terrible chapter of history? First, the cost of war falls most heavily on those who have least say in whether wars are fought. The Okinawan civilians, the conscripted students, the young kamikaze pilots, the teenage Marines, they didn't start the war, but they paid the ultimate price. Second, the Battle of Okinawa reveals the danger of military cultures that value death over surrender, that see civilians as expendable, that prioritize abstract concepts like honor over human life. The Japanese military's treatment of Okinawan civilians, the forcing of students into combat, the distribution of grenades for suicide, these were moral failures that compounded the tragedy. Third, Okinawa reminds us that even just wars produce atrocities and suffering that haunt generations. American forces fought to defeat fascism and militarism, noble goals, but the indiscriminate firepower that killed thousands of civilians, the flamethrowers that incinerated people in caves, the total war that reduced an island to a wasteland, these raise profound moral questions about means and ends. Eugene Sledge, the young Marine who survived Okinawa, later wrote, "The worst part of the fighting on Okinawa was not the Japanese, nor the elements, nor the fear of death. It was the battle against the erosion of our own souls. The battlefield had dehumanized everyone who fought there, turning ordinary young men into killers who felt nothing at the sight of death." The survivors of Okinawa, American, Japanese, and Okinawans, spent the rest of their lives grappling with what they experienced. Some found peace, others never did. The trauma passed to their children and grandchildren in ways subtle and profound. Today, as we remember the Battle of Okinawa, we honor the courage of those who fought, the suffering of those who died, and the resilience of those who survived. We remember not to glorify war, but to understand its true cost. We remember so that future generations might choose different paths. The island of Okinawa has recovered in remarkable ways. It is once again green and lush, its people vibrant and resilient. But beneath the surface, both literally and metaphorically, the battle remains. Unexploded ordnance still kills people decades later. The military bases still dominate parts of the island. The memories still haunt families who lost loved ones. The lesson of Okinawa is simple but profound. War destroys far more than it creates. It took 82 days to reduce Okinawa to rubble and kill 250,000 people. It has taken 80 years to partially heal, and the healing is still incomplete. As we face an uncertain future, with tensions rising in the Pacific and around the world, Okinawa stands as a warning. The next war, should it come, will be even more destructive than the last. The weapons are more powerful. The potential for mass casualties is greater. The suffering would be unimaginable. The people who fought at Okinawa, on all sides, would tell us one thing: if they could, find another way. Resolve conflicts through diplomacy, compromise, and understanding. Because the alternative, as Okinawa proved, is hell on earth. Remember that every casualty figure represents a person, someone's son or daughter, father or mother, brother or sister. Remember that wars have consequences that echo through generations.